What is useful about education? Tooting my own horn or depressing point of order.
I've run the numbers a little bit, not a lot but a little bit, and I suspect that perhaps 0.0001% of the world's population has a formal education in the fields that I do. Translating to perhaps 8,000 people. So, pretty tiny numbers. This in no small part because the fields I have a formal education in are not super popular in terms of getting a formal education in them, philosophy and gender studies. We could and likely ought narrow that down a bit further by noting that beyond my formal education, I've a lot of informal education I've done over the years. I read, study, write, organize, etc., in a lot of other fields of academic and practical study. Maybe among the most relevant to note are mathematics, theology, physics, pedagogy, and cosmology, and organizing around labor, sexual, racial and gender justice, as those are areas I have spent a majority of my non-formal academic study time on. Well, aside from philosophy and gender studies. And indeed, within formal educational structures, I intensely studied fields beyond gender studies and philosophy, some to the point where I almost could have a degree in them too. Perhaps, in other words, there are only 10% of people who have that formal education who also have a comparable informal education, in which case we're talking about 800 people in the world, give or take. It may even be closer to 1% of such formally educated folks, as most folks go into professional fields of one sort or another. In which case it's more like 80 people. Which is kinda depressing tbh, wink with a frown.
Education as processing power.
Now, the point here isn't exactly to note what a rare bird I am, though that is in and of itself an interesting thing to note, it is to get at the value of an education, perhaps especially in the currents of reality, whereby many things can simply be looked up and access to learning is, well, compared to the before times, it is super easy. The rarity of me though is relevant for that kind of understanding, for, I can do something that others lacking such an education can't, even by way of the internets. I can process, analyze and synthesize a given subject, topic, etc., internally and cross-referencing the various fields. In other words, someone lacking this education certainly can look it up, and they can even take the time to learn about it themselves, but in either case they do not as yet have the tools available to them to analyze the content, let alone criticize it, or cross-reference it to other relevant fields of study. Lacking such an education, I may be bright and not easily fooled, but when I receive a bit of info, the only way I can cross-reference it, do a real, deep dive into it, etc., is to look up other pieces of info online, check out books, talk to someone else, etc., all of which are externalized processes of, well, processing information. Moreover, until one becomes trained in doing such things, they remain external processings of something. In other words, someone can cross-reference a bit O, info A by way of a bit O, info B, but unless they've learned not just A and B, but also the relevant processes whereby such a cross-referencing can occur, the processes of reference themselves remain external to them. For an educated person, those kinds of processes are internalized to some non-trivial degree. For me, for relevant instance, I can often internally process philosophical and feministic content without having to utilize the internets to look things up, nor, and more importantly, do I have to laboriously go through the external processing of analysis and synthesis. If this be unclear, and I suspect it be so, consider such by way of not so unrealistic or abstracted an example. Suppose you want to know something, and you have several experts in the room, each specialized in some field or another. You can ask each of them questions related to their field of expertise, but once the inquiry goes beyond their field of expertise, they've little much left to offer. That is a bit of an oversimplification, but not entirely off base. Suppose that you've an inquiry that actually spans multiple fields of expertise. One has to go from person to person, gathering info, and processing it oneself, internally. That processing at this point remains opaque, it is what one clearly does, but it isn't something that is instantiated by way of the experts themselves. Now, suppose that you aren't an expert, you're a layperson, learning in the first place. Such isn't an impossible task, not by a long shot. Such practically defines learning, school, etc. But the point here is that howsoever that be processed, it isn't being processed by an expert. The position, in other words, will be fairly naive, unsophisticated, and not necessarily trustworthy. We might hold that learning to process such interfield expertise is itself something of an expertise, but again, that gets a bit beyond the point of this short piece. Suppose that we have the experts themselves talk among themselves, eschewing all the possible difficulties involved thereof, such as communication, limits of understanding, etc. Such would take a lot of time, for one thing. Even playing pretend on the removal of the practical difficulties involved for the experts themselves, we are still also left with a boring point of argumentativeness. That is, these differing people have differing views, egos, and standpoints from which they are likely to be arguing from. The kind of synthesis required by such an enterprise is markedly different from that which occurs internally, that is, by way of one's brain. All the best experts in the room may have a remarkably more difficult time simply analyzing something, let alone synthesizing something predicated upon their respective expertise. Whereas much of that may occur de facto by way of the brain processes of one person. As in, the concepts themselves literally and figuratively grew up together. For me, for relevant instance, I regularly and fairly easily analyze and synthesize information related to my fields of expertise quickly, relative to the aforementioned examples, generally without a great deal of conflict, though that hasn't always been the case. Honestly, I have no one internally I am lying to, at least not generally. I could be lying to myself, I mean, but that would be a pretty different sort of phenomenon, and I have modes of connectivity between these otherwise disparate fields of expertise, quite literally by way of the various brain processes that go on. For me, to think of some aspect of a field, very often entails also connecting to some other aspect of some otherwise unrelated field. Now, none of this guarantees correctness on my part. After all, I do nonetheless come at it from a perspective that has been thusly honed. Others with similar educational backgrounds may have come to differing conclusions on the same sorts of topics. Though there are some interesting arguments to be made regarding the plausible virtues of truth-finding in being able to so easily cross-reference between otherwise disparate fields of inquiry, such as sound and multi-pronged critical analysis, multiple modes of checking the validity of a proposition, and even a capacity for divergent views that nonetheless retain a common root, something not really possible outside the context of the brain. But it does provide for a rather different perspective, enables a kind of analysis that, which possible in other contexts, is quite difficult to achieve outside the brain structure, and has a tempo to it that is simply unmatched by any other means in the current, including the entirety of the Internet's itself. Even a hive mind effect remains effectively lesser, to be perfectly blunt about it. Though it is an interesting tool for use regardless, a tool better handled and utilized by the educated than not. There is a sense, and an important one too, that there is nothing special about me in that regard either. That is, such more or less defines education, living, learning, lived experiences, and so forth. Education as a formal or informal structure though does extend, sharpen, and strengthen the processing. There is, for that matter, something that is learned by way of especially formal education of the processing itself. Refinements, improvements on the predicable base of processing, both in general and in regards of specific, oft-field specific, aims. Criticisms of one discipline by another for experts in either may take on a character of attack and defense, whereas for me, at least generally, such isn't the case, especially as regards the academics of it. I admit that like everyone else, I have susceptibility to other sorts of biases, but here at least I don't really carry forth significant biases as a matter of expertise and disciplines. And here's the thing, I am hardly alone in this. I know many a folk have done similar sorts of things in tandem with the rise of the Internets especially, whereby, again, information, education, became so readily available. When folks refer to something they know, a fact they've learned, or an opinion they have, it isn't that such ought necessarily be taken as lesser or greater than some other fact or opinion, though such ought be seriously considered. It is that educated opinions are far more well-formed, of broader scope, and oft enough have undergone more significant criticism than they otherwise would have. In the instances of interdisciplinary understandings, this is at least arguably all the more the case. I am reminded of the mathematicians in the currents, who, typically long years later and elsewhere in their studies, stumble across Platonic thought for the first time, and are forced to really consider what the mathematical claims really are. What they've been doing the whole time. How, that is, Neoplatonic they really are, how cultish they really are. None of which ought necessarily be taken as a bad, it is just a striking example of how isolated and difficult the experts may be, how oft wrong they may be simply in virtue of their isolated expertise. All the more so for the even further undereducated folks. How small a bubble some folks have.
Education as bullshit detector.
There are ways and means whereby this is a somewhat obvious point, as in, if I am educated in a given field, I can pretty easily tell if someone is saying something that is factually incorrect. I don't have to look it up and go off of a vibe about the person as to if I bother to look it up or not. This is true of factual statements of a wide variety of sorts, but is more applicable regarding non-small factual fudges. In other words, someone likely could slip some factual fudge of some numbers under the radar of the educated bullshit detector, but the larger claims, the claims of bravado, the statements that strike the non-educated as oft interesting due to exactly their appearance, to the educated look deeply suspect. Beyond the factual, there are in the internets a far more troubling problem, that of folks' inability to accept that something they learned might be wrong. This is something that is taught via formal education, that is oft not taught in the online and informal educational operati. In the formal educational structures, there are differing viewpoints offered as a matter of course. One learns about a topic from the get-go not as a one solution, but rather, as there being a plurality of plausible solutions to a given problem. For the uneducated, to come across some answer, even a plausible one, online, is too oft the end of their studies. They learn the answer, and hence, everything else must be wrong. Such isn't exactly the same as having an opinion on a matter, it is far more a difficulty in coming to grips with the fact that not only are there other opinions on the matter, but also those opinions might have some correctness to them, your opinion might have some incorrectness to them, and so forth. As a bullshit detector, this is particularly valuable, as it enables folks to hear when someone is expressing a view that lacks any good temperament to it. When someone is ideologuing or when they are oversimplifying something. In the currents, for instance, I regularly notice this occurring within the feminist dialoguing, perhaps more generally regarding social justice dialoguing, whereby certain views within feminist theory are mistaken as if they were the entirety of feminist theory. This occurs by those on the political right and left, for differing reasons and ways. Among the more important points thereof being that the fight is in as if determining what is and isn't a real feminist. Another important point thereof being that folks on the political right are also oft enough expressing actual feminist views, even when they are claiming to not be feminists themselves. Indeed, even though they are oft enough claiming, I think unwitfully, that they are against feminism. What they mean really is that there is a version of feminism, a set of theories or even just a theory within feminism that they are against, which really they just associate with the political left. The left does similar but with a marked difference, in that they want to be feminists, but then they demarcate what is allowed to be feminist towards some specific view they picked up online. Likewise, and not surprisingly, the left tends to deny that the political right is actually expressing a feminist view at all. Note how this can also be understood as in the current attempting to be instituted within the university system itself, e.g. the unwitful politically motivated differing views on feminism and philosophy more broadly, as unartfully learned online and within the context of political divisions and divisiveness, are not being held as if they were the correct views that ought be instituted in universities towards the exclusion of other views. In other words, the utter bullshitting stupidity of the online discourses is being taken foolishly seriously by folks as if it were constitutive of anything akin to an actual formal education. Now, this whole thing just springs forth my spidey senses on the topic because I know for a fact that all those views are actually various feminist views. Well, okay, definitely not all of them, and many of the views out there are actually better classified as philosophical views, but the point stands erect well here. There are differing feministic views in the discourses, with folks peacocking it, claiming either that they are not feminists at all and castigating others on the grounds that feminism's bad, which feminism? What feministic theories, or, folks are castigating others on the grounds you're not a real feminist, what is a real feminist? Which theories? To an educated ear on the topic, again, the whole thing is clearly bullshit. We are taught all these different views as being feministic views, much like we are taught that there are a plethora of philosophical theories. Holding to one or the other of these views doesn't negate the others as a feminist viewpoint. It is wrong or not for other reasons, not because it isn't feminist. Something isn't, for the left, correct because it is feminist, nor for the right is something incorrect because it is feminist. A view is feminist or not for other kinds of reasons, namely, ones that have to do with concerning themselves with issues of gendered equality, roughly speaking. A feminist view is better or worse within a feminist framework predicated upon its capacity to analyze gendered reality, and deliver on gendered equality. A feminist view is wrong for reasons that have to do with other things aside from feminism properly speaking. As in, to give an aptly clarifying, but not necessarily true example, a feminist view could be a good view from within feminism, in that it analyzes gender well or has the capacity to deliver on gendered equality, and yet it might nonetheless be wrong, as in it doesn't comport to reality well. It might, in other words, be false, or indeed, even undesirable for various other ethical reasons. It may be that, for instance, some theory delivers on and analyzes gendered equality well, and yet it is a racist ideology, or, it turns out that it is dependent upon things that are not true, such as if the patriarchy simply isn't factually true. This is an artifact of the theoretical operati of feminist theory, which did not set as their backdrop truth, but rather, a notion of gendered equality. Which entails that gendered equality might run up against truth.
Undereducated talking points.
Education can make for silences. Not unrelated to the immediately preceding section, when one is fairly well educated in a topic, there is often enough a kind of quietude that comes about one. It isn't necessarily so, nor is it necessarily from a place of ease or assuredness, though it could be. Often enough it is from a place of uncertitude, an understanding that things are not as simple as one might think they are, and hence, a cautiousness about speaking at all on the topics. This is perhaps familiar enough to folks these days by way of the Dunning-Kruger effect, whereby folks that know little of a subject may tend to be the most confident in their knowledge of it. I am here merely noting the flip side of that effect and applying it to the point of speaking at all. Consider by way of example, flat earthers. Provided that one actually comes to an understanding that the world is not flat, one no longer really has a reason to discuss that point anymore. Education, in that sense, creates a bit of silence on a topic. However, the issues are more complex overall, to wit, notice that flat eartherism somehow or another made a comeback in the modern age. Moreover, some issues may not have solutions that are undynamic. That is, they may have solutions, but those solutions actually entail a kind of dynamism of the topic, as that is just how the abstract entities of note interrelate. See on conspiracy piece in this short series. In which case the fairly simplistic and easy sorts of talking points aren't really applicable, but those are the ones that are typically given. Or, the correct solutions involved may actually entail an oscillating between differing opinions on the matter in total. Such as may be the case regarding, for instance, the balancing of various freedoms with various restrictive capacities. Hence, again, there is a sense of quietude stemming from education, either for reasons of the dynamism involved, as in not wanting to upset that dynamic, or for reasons that note that the solutions are dynamic, and hence that the general talking points are kinda bunkus. Somewhat more troublingly, some aspects may entail differing opinions simply as a matter of course in life. As in, an opinion on something may entail some other and differing opinion on the subject. Consider again the flat eartherism, whereby simply by talking about it online, one thereby risks perpetuating the view as it gives the view a semblance of credibility. Or, as is likely the case with flat eartherism, the view of flat eartherism is the naive view, something the species simply goes through because that is how the species experiences the world. In either case, such engenders a sense of quietude on the part of the educated. One can kinda get a sense of the degree of degrees about a subject by the amount of chatter that goes on online regarding them. Or, at any rate, such would be a proper supposition to make given this effect. The more folks talk about something, the less likely they are to have a degree in it, a good education in it, etc. The more online chatter there is about something, the more indicative it is that folks lack any kind of formal education in the matters. This though deserves some fair amount of qualifications and clarifications to it. After all, it is also the case that folks who are knowledgeable about a subject are also likely to be interested in speaking about, learning about, etc., the subject. Perhaps especially toward specific groups and circumstances. Moreover, folks that are interested in a given subject in general are more likely to be talking about it, and there is something of a learning curve implied here, whereby folks not at all talking about a topic are likely uninterested in the topic at all. As they grow to learn about the topic, they chatter a bunch about it, have false bravado, confidence, etc., and then become quieter on the subject as they learn that it is more complex. Assuming they learn that wink with a frown. But here we are speaking of society-wide sorts of phenomenon, and more particular still, the current phenomenon of social media. That is, a well-educated individual may speak about what they're educated on much, may even enjoy speaking about such topics, especially in certain settings, with other nerds, dorks, geeks, etc. But as a matter of what society as a whole tends to talk about, what online discourses are primarily focused on, the undereducated tend toward speaking about such topics far more. They tend to speak with more assuredness on the topic, more bravado, and more oft indeed tending to have more strongly held and poorly formed opinions on the matter. Those things going hand in hand, having that poorly formed opinion entailing an in proportion degree of being strongly held. Just coming at this from my perspective here, but for relevant instance I see a lot of folks chatting about philosophy and feminism, and I know there ain't that many of y'all with actual degrees in the topic. As I opened with this pointing out, in terms of formal education on the topics, there are perhaps 8,000 folks in the world with that educational combo. The numbers rise a goodly bit if we aren't speaking of that specific combo, but still, those particular disciplines of study are among the least popular in formal education, so I know that most folks, the overwhelming majority of folks with degrees haven't studied those topics at all. Indeed, I know that most y'all haven't even ever read a book in either field, or if you have, you've taken that to be the answer, to which you now adhere yourselves like flies to sticky paper. Someone somewhere heard a thing that stoked their pleasure places, and now that's the mainstay of their theory. They present themselves as experts, and over time they've latched on to whatever other theoretical operati they can to justify themselves. Hence, for instance, fostering an unhealthy distrust of experts. Forgive me, for I do actually think there is a healthy distrust one can have of experts. The healthy distrust of experts arising from becoming an expert in a field, while the unhealthy distrust of experts arising from being ignorant of the field. Lived experience and one's identity may be used to justify a view, as in, how would you know, all you did was read a book. Never mind that that book was written by someone with that lived experience and identity. Never mind indeed that I've read many different books and perspectives from folks with those lived experiences and identities. Here we can get a glimpse of the peculiar horrors of online interactions, the tendency for the undereducated, the foolish, to spread. There are incentives within that structure that can be fought against, but they are present, whereby people pridefully hold themselves up as if their opinions were on a par with everyone else's, or indeed, perhaps even superior to everyone else's, for any reason they can manage to. Here though, as fruitful a point as that can be regarding how to understand online social interactions, I want to note it and move at least somewhat away from it, as I am at least somewhat skeptical about the value of such things. That is, I think there may actually be real value in that sort of life, living, understanding, such that it may be a detriment to the quality of living if it were managed away. Value here not being towards truth, understanding, or such things, but towards love and living together. Pragmatics too of conversations, talking, enjoyment. This doesn't even touch upon the reality that those other opinions exist, they are people in some non-trivial sense, and hence they are real in an important sense. They are not wrong in the sense that most folks use that term at any rate, whereby wrong is a stand-in for non-existence or even an ought to non-existence. They may though be wrong in the senses of factually wrong, or against the truth of the matters. In any case though, the point here is that such dispositions, opinions, views, modes of living, modes of loving, are deserving of existence, and ought not be managed away. See the odd questions of privilege, a slight history of colonialism. Nonetheless, there is a usefulness about an education that looks upon those and understands them for what they are, and hence doesn't really take them overly seriously as indicative of a deeper truth. This is all the more so relevant in regards to those fields which purport themselves to be towards the truth. In other words, I have more concern about folks spouting off BS regarding philosophy, feminism, sciences, etc., than I do about, say, politics, celebrities, opinions about local ordinances, and so forth. Partly the concern there is that folks present themselves as if they were expert in a topic they are not, and then utilize that position as if it were one of authority on the matter. Philosophers and feminists, scientists and scholars, these folks are not. These can get muddled together, but here the main thrust concerns the capacity for an educated person to look upon such things and understand them for what they are, utter fucking bullshit.
What you say, governor?